Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you all for signing on. There's over 100 of you today. So we are going to go through some general advice about the legislation that was passed only last week. Feels like a lifetime ago. Just to let you know, this webinar is just for general advice only on the JobKeeper payment and a bit of hospitality awards information. There is still a lot of information, or some information, that's still got to come out from the ATO, but hopefully we'll be able to answer some of the questions that we asked you to pre-register. I'd like to introduce Joanna, who she's our industrial relations. She's the industrial relations manager for Queensland Hotels Association, and she's going to hopefully answer some of your questions and provide some of that general information on the JobKeeper payment. Like I said, we did get a lot of pre-registered questions, so we are going to try and answer most of those first, and if we have time for other questions, I have the Q&A function is available, and we'll see how far we get through within the hour. I'd just like to say, so the JobKeeper, and Joanna might go into this a bit more in her presentation or her speech, but it did amend the Fair Work Act, so it is industrial relations advice. It's not a grant scheme or what have you that you apply for. So it is important that this is just the start to give you some general information, but it will be important that you work through with your relevant association and work through your employees and their specific circumstances and how you go about doing it. So Joanna, can you unmute your microphone and we can get started?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I think I pressed unmute. You pressed it. So anyway, I'm here now. And thank you very much for the opportunity to come along and talk about JobKeeper. It's certainly been something that's been keeping us pretty busy with lots of queries, and no doubt you have got heaps of them in terms of how it's meant to work. I thought I'd give you a little bit of background to it. So back on the 30th of March, when the government announced the concept of the job seeker payment, what we needed to see happen was legislation passed to enact it. So last Wednesday, there was a special sitting of Parliament, and there were two bills that were put forward. So I'm going to sort of swivel my head around a bit because I've got all the information up on my other screen. But the two bills that were put forward, there was one called the Coronavirus Economic Response Package Payments and Benefits Bill, and the second one was the Coronavirus Economic Response Package Omnibus Measures Number 2 Bill. So the first one was to deal with the payments and eligibility. The second one, as Sarah mentioned, was to vary the Fair Work Act. So both of those bills went through the House of Representatives on Wednesday, and then quite late in the night they both passed through the Senate. They weren't changed in any way, which was anticipated because the opposition had said that they wanted to see the bills move through. Now, at this current time, we don't have the bills having received royal assent, so they're still in bill form, but royal assent is just the final part of legislation going through the process. What we also had happen on Thursday night was the rules that were developed by the Treasurer in terms of the payments and the eligibility aspects of JobKeeper come through. So as you can imagine, that was at about 9 o'clock on Thursday night. We've had a long weekend in the interim, so we've been madly over the last few days just trying to get to understand what the rules provide. And unfortunately, but I also have to say probably not surprisingly, not everything has been finalised as yet. So the ATO plays a really key part when it comes to the JobKeeper payment, and they're yet to release some of their template forms. But what I can tell you is that the rules detail eligibility for employers and for employees, and they go into some detail about that. There are also eligibilities where you've got a sole trader in play as well. They deal with where employees have a couple of jobs in terms of you can't have JobKeeper twice, so there needs to be discussions there. So I guess I'll just move forward with some of the things, and I guess that the main thing you've probably got some questions about is the process to make JobKeeper happen. So if you haven't already, there is a portal in their ATO website where you can register your interest for the JobKeeper payment program. That's just registering your interest. From there, with a form that is still to be released, you then complete it as an eligible employer to essentially say to the ATO, I would like to participate in it. It is voluntary for an employer to decide whether they want to be part of it or not. And I guess it's a business decision in terms of weighing up how it could work for you. But there are quite a lot of employers who have already registered for it. From there, once you've expressed your interest, it's a matter of looking at your employees to see who is, again, eligible for it. So there are some provisos where not all employees will be able to access the JobKeeper payment, and I can go through that shortly. Once you know who your eligible employees are, they all must be put forward. So it's not a case of choosing which eligible employee you want to participate. It's basically a one-in, all-in system. If you're eligible as an employer, then all of your eligible employees are essentially to be paid the JobKeeper. Now, this is a key thing that we thought last week with some of the discussion about JobKeeper. We thought there might have been a choosing element to it, but that's not the case, and the rules have confirmed it. So it's for you as an employer, you need to look at who might be eligible according to the eligibility criteria. Then there needs to be a discussion, I guess, between you and your employees to let your employees know that they are eligible and that you're putting their name forward. Employees then have to accept that nomination for JobKeeper in writing with a form that the ATO will provide that isn't yet available. And then from there, the ATO will confirm that you are, as an employer, eligible. So those turnover tests will be key as part of that assessment. What I would say is that you're best off, when you're looking at how the assessment works, talk to your financial advisors, because there is quite a lot of detail that's necessary, financial records and so forth, that needs to be available to the ATO for them to assess you. And then once you've been told that you're eligible, then you will need to start making payments. And those payments are $1,500 per fortnight. That's before tax. Because it will be processed through your single touch payroll, the ATO will be able to keep track that the payments are being made, because under the JobKeeper legislation, it is compulsory for an employer to pass on the full amount of the JobKeeper payment. So that's, I guess, a snapshot idea of the application process. Eligibility rules are fairly detailed for the employer in terms of needing to meet particular turnover tests. Interestingly, if you have a business that's gone into liquidation, you won't be eligible for JobKeeper, even though that there's a financial imperative there. Anyone in liquidation, and if you've got a partnership, a trust or a sole trader in bankruptcy, they won't be eligible either. So for employee eligibility, there is a list. One of the things that we get a lot of queries on is the casual aspect. So must they be employed for 12 months on a regular and systematic basis? That is correct. So if you've got a casual who has less than 12 months of service with you as of the 1st of March, then they won't be an eligible employee. Likewise, if you have someone who is less than 16 years of age at the 1st of March, they won't be eligible either. I noticed there was a question about visa holders. Not all visa employees will be able to get JobKeeper. It's very limited. So if you've got a permanent visa, a protected special category visa, a non-protected special category visa, and you've been residing in Australia for 10 years or more, you're covered. If you're a New Zealander on a subclass 444 visa, you're covered as well. But for the 457 visa, no, unfortunately, JobKeeper will not be available for them. If you have an employee who has 2 jobs, they won't be able to get JobKeeper for both. They need to actually notify which employer will be the primary employer for the purposes of JobKeeper. And there are actually fairly significant penalties that will apply if someone tries to do the wrong thing and double dip.
Joanna, just on that, sorry, we just had a question come through. So whose responsibility is it to assess the primary employer?
Well, that's a
on the employee.
It will be a discussion with the employer and the employee. So at the time that the employer expresses their interest with the ATO and then starts that process of seeking JobKeeper, they need to have a discussion with the employee to say, I have nominated you for it. Now, one of the forms that the ATO is going to make available, hopefully sometime soon, will be a document where the employee signs to the effect that they are not seeking JobKeeper from another employer. So there's a discussion with the employer and the employee, but the employee themselves has to actually, I guess, attest to the fact that they're not going to try and double dip. Yeah. Okay, so that's probably as much of an overview I've got in the time that I've got. So what I'll do is I'll jump straight to some of the questions, if that's all right, Sarah, unless you've got any other questions before.
No, that sounds good.
Okay, great. Now, some of these questions are very similar, so I will answer them all. Are employees required to work when receiving JobKeeper? This is a really good question because JobKeeper is also payable to someone who is on stand down or on a period of leave. So at the time that the government direction was made for the 23rd of March to close non-essential businesses, we recommended to employers that they stand their employees down under the Fair Work Act. And the stand down provisions in the Act are that for circumstances outside of the employer's control, there's a stoppage of work, which is what occurred in hospitality. With the JobKeeper, someone who's already on stand down will receive it. They don't have to be back in the workplace working hours. Chances are you probably don't have the hours available for everyone who's on your payroll. The key thing I would say in terms of if you did want to bring someone back to work is that you are effectively rescinding the stand down. So the circumstances for allowing you to rescind the stand down, you've just got to be mindful of, and I guess a bit cautious with, to make sure that circumstances have changed enough to reverse the original decision. It may be that you have some work that needs to be done, odd jobs around the place, where, for example, you're using this as an opportunity to refresh, to put a new coat of paint on, to redo your menus, to update your website. So you need some people available for that. You can certainly look to rescind a stand down. You just have to make sure that you've got the justification for doing that. rather than feeling that you have to bring them back into the workplace. So one of the questions that I'm getting a lot of is, so my employees can just sit at home on a Netflix binge and they get the JobKeeper? Yes, that's the answer. If you've got nothing for them to do in the workplace, that's essentially what they do. They're on stand down and they get the payment anyway. For anyone who is still working, like in your bottle shops or accommodation section, they will also get the JobKeeper, and it's a subsidy. So it's a payment that goes towards what their wages costs are. So there's a benefit in as much as it's not costing you as much from a wage perspective. So if you want to bring someone back, you can do so. Again, with the caution I mentioned before, in terms of bringing them back in a different way to what they were doing beforehand, this is where the variation to the Fair Work Act comes in through the Omnibus bill. And it provides that essentially what you can do if you want to bring someone back from stand down because you have work for them to do, you can reduce the number of hours that they're working as part of their normal contractual conditions to fit within the $750 per week or $1,500 per fortnight amount. You cannot reduce their hourly rate of pay. There is a protection that is very clearly in the new section of the Fair Work Act. But you can, for example, look at a full-time employee, say, well, $750 is approximately, for numbers' sake, 20 hours per week. You can give them a direction that they will come back to work on 20 hours per week. And that is designed so that you can still have people productive, but it's not going to cost you any extra, if that makes sense. Now, to be able to do that, you have to put in place what's called a JobKeeper enabled stand down. So that will be different to your current stand down, and you can only do that when the ATO has approved you as an eligible employer and that process starts. So that's not something you can do right now, but certainly you can start thinking about what you might want from your hours perspective, what work you've got going, what you need, maybe rotating your staff around so that everyone maintains that connection with the workplace, which is what JobKeeper is supposed to do. So that's the Fair Work Act amendments. Now, for those of you who are covered by the Hospitality Industry General Award, there was an amendment that came through late March, the 24th, I think it was, maybe, that provided that as a short-term new schedule to the award, that you could actually direct a reduction in hours for your full-time and your part-time employees, but the reduction could only be to range within 60 to 100% of what their normal hours would be. So that was a flexibility that definitely was able to be utilised. This Fair Work Act amendment doesn't have, as far as I've been able to tell, and there is new information coming out all the time, so I will make that clear. Things could be subject to some change, but certainly from the Fair Work Act, that 60% is not in place. So that might be a way in which you can look at bringing people back to the workplace to be involved. So I hope that answers that question. If a full-timer, okay, if you've got an employee who earns less than $750 per week or $1,500 per week, so you've brought a casual back and their normal on average rate of pay is $500 per week, you need to pass on that full $750 to them. So it needs to always be topped up to at least what the JobKeeper amount is. If you were to bring a full-time employee back to work on a full-time basis, then you must pay them what they normally would receive for having worked a full-time rate of pay. The $750 is a subsidy, it's not a payment. per se. It's not wages in respect of hours worked. It's a subsidy for the employer. Okay, sorry, I'm just working through the questions. Annual leave, there's a question about is annual leave payment included in the $750 or additional to? Because it's a subsidy, it is included. So if someone's on a period of annual leave, and just say that normally costs $2,000 per fortnight, for them to be on annual leave, the $750 can be used as a subsidy to go towards that $2,000. So they'd normally get what they would for being on leave, and so that's a benefit to you as the employer to go against the cost of paying the annual leave. If someone's on any other form of paid leave, they can also get the job subsidy. So if they are on personal carers leave, then the $1,500 per fortnight will go towards the cost of that form of leave. And I think this is worthwhile just contemplating, because if you have an when you put your employees on stand down a couple of weeks ago, some of you may have said, because you don't get paid during the stand down, you can take your annual leave. An employee is not on stand down when they're on a form of leave. So if they're on annual leave or long service leave, all the normal rules would apply when it came to entitlements, particularly over the public holidays that we've just had. If they're on a period of stand down with no pay, it's our position they wouldn't have got any benefit from the public holidays that just fell. So does an employee get their annual leave reimbursed to them because of JobKeeper? No, that would be a discussion that you would have with them. But if you've already got a pre-approved form of leave, I'd be tempted to stick with it and utilise the JobKeeper subsidy to go towards that cost. Will employees be required to exhaust any or all of their leave before getting JobKeeper? No, they don't have to take that leave. They might want to take the leave while they're on JobKeeper, and you just top up the $750 to what the normal annual leave payment would be. Okay, casual employees work seasonally from April for 2 years. To be eligible, you need to be employed as of the 1st of March this year. If they weren't employed at that point in time, they won't be eligible. And that goes for any new employee that is brought on after that date. So what I would say with that is that I know some members looked at redundancies of positions when the closures occurred. In that situation, unless you decide to rehire them, they're not on your books. If you do decide to rehire an employee whose position was made redundant, you will then need to have a discussion with the employee about any redundancy payments that you made to them for them to pay it back to you. They're not obliged to pay it back because the redundancy occurred. So you have to have that discussion with them. Now, it may be that discussion doesn't go anywhere, so they don't get rehired. But certainly, if you did have some employees who you'd like to have on the books to help them out, then that's something that you will need to work through. Okay, some of these.
Joanna, just on that, so if you had an employee who was employed as of 1st of March,
yes,
but has since been terminated,
yes,
you can rehire them,
yes,
and they will be eligible for the JobKeeper.
Yes, that's your decision as the employer.
Yeah.
But any termination that occurred because of the business closure was a termination due to the redundancy of their position.
Yeah.
So for anyone who's permanent, then you would have had to have paid out severance and notice because that's the reason for the termination. Casuals you wouldn't have, so there's no issue there, unless and severance and notice and maybe leave entitlements that may have been paid out. So it could be that there was a fair amount of money paid to the employee because of the redundancy. So you just need to look at how you manage that. When I say the employee doesn't have to pay it back, it's because their position was made redundant. To actually seek a recovery of those amounts, you need to go to court for that. So that's going to cost you some money to pursue that repayment option. So I guess you just need to weigh up what sort of costs you might have incurred, what you're going to get back, and therefore what you want to do with that position. Yeah. Okay, one of the questions is to do with the payment. Now we're still awaiting some confirmation from the ATO with some of their forms, but it looks like for JobKeeper it's a payment that's made every fortnight in arrears, monthly in arrears, but it's for a fortnightly period. So the first fortnight of the JobKeeper payment was the 30th of March to the 12th of April. The second period is the 13th to the 26th of April. So there'll be a lot of employers who haven't made a payment for that first fortnight, and that's okay, because we've actually been saying to members, don't make payments until the legislation's through, because if you make a payment and then you subsequently go through the ATO process and they say you're not eligible, well then that's a cost that you have to bear. You get nothing back. The ATO won't make it up just because you were trying to be the nice guy in the situation. So we've been saying wait until the legislation comes through. We're still saying hold off. There are some transitional arrangements because one of the requirements for an employer is that you must be making payments, and the ATO can see that through single touch payroll. So it's only when they see that they'll keep making those payments from the first week of May in arrears. We have until the end of April to start making payments. So it may be that you prefer to wait until the ATO says you're eligible, your employees are eligible, and then you start making the payments, knowing that in May you'll be reimbursed for them. That's a decision for you. I guess what I would say is that until you know you're eligible, it's your risk if you make the payments and then subsequently you don't get a reimbursement because you're not eligible. And that's why I think also when you're looking at the turnover, your financial advisors are going to be able to give you the best review of your finances to make sure you meet that threshold criteria as well with the turnover amount. Okay. Now, a couple of other questions. Paid parental leave. If you've got an employee who's on the government paid parental leave scheme, during the period of that paid parental leave, they won't get the JobKeeper. That's because they're receiving a payment from Services Australia. Now, the interesting thing is, and I was looking this up the other day, is that paid parental leave, the amount is $740.80 per week. The JobKeeper is $750 per week, so it's very similar, those amounts. If you have an employee who's on workers' compensation at the moment, they won't receive JobKeeper, but if they are on, say, light duties as part of return to work and performing work for you, they will get it. If your employee resigns, you need to notify the ATO as soon as you know that. And depending on the timing of the resignation, it may be that you have to pay the ATO the balance back. So employees, oh, this is a good question. Employees given notice for mechanic and manager, can they be brought back through the JobKeeper scheme as caretakers? One of the fantastic things about our awards is that it talks about being able to work across classifications. And in fact, Schedule L in the Hospitality Award reaffirms the ability for an employer to say, you're a chef, but I don't need you to perform work as a chef. What I need is for someone to stand the tables, get ready to polish them up. So you can ask your staff to work in other areas or do other jobs, provided that it is safe for them to do so and they have the relevant competency. If the job that you're asking them to do is at a lower rate of pay than what they're currently on, so I'll use the chef example, who might be on level 6 under the Hospitality Award. You want them to do some painting in the hotel, give it a fresh lick of paint. That's a handy person classification. We're looking at that chef being paid level 6 for doing that tradesperson rate. You don't drop it down to level 3 rate of pay. You keep it at the rate of pay they're on. However, if it was reversed and you had someone who is a food and beverage attendant grade 1 who you wanted to paint the walls, which is handy person grade 3, because they're not trade qualified, then you would have to pay them higher duties for that additional work that they're doing. So in that scenario, mechanic, manager and caretaker, what I'd suggest is just be mindful of what the classifications are for those particular roles, because if what you're asking someone to do is at a higher level, you have to pay the higher rate of pay.
Joanna, we just had a question come through the Q&A of what if the employee refuses to do the work that you have available?
Yep. Okay, another good question, and I think probably a few of you were thinking, yeah, that could very much happen with an employee saying, I don't want to come back. If an employee says, I don't want to come back because I'm worried about getting coronavirus, then I would have a discussion with the employee about the measures that you have put in place to keep them safe in the workplace, because you've got that work health and safety obligation. If they just simply say, oh, my partner's on stand down, I'd rather hang out with him, we've just got into this really great Netflix series, I want to stay on stand down, that's not their decision, because the stand down is something that you've implemented because of the circumstances in the Fair Work Act. What you are doing is rescinding their stand down, which means that they are required to work. So you are giving them a lawful and reasonable direction in telling them that the stand down has been rescinded and that they must return to work. If they still refuse to, then it may be that you end up going through a disciplinary process with them. That could lead to termination of employment in the end. But I would be explaining to the employee, this is a reasonable and lawful direction. This is, and I'd use that terminology, and that they must return to work. And if they don't, the implications will be disciplinary action. If the employee understands that if they're terminated, JobKeeper stops, well, then they might actually be a bit more willing to come back into the workplace. But it's your decision as the employer regarding the stand down. They can't say, I'm standing myself down, or I want to stay stood down. That's your decision. Yeah. Okay. In terms of, just having a look through some of these questions. Superannuation, there's a question here about that. So there are essentially 3 scenarios where we're looking at superannuation. If an employee is on stand down, they're not required to come back to work and they are in receipt of the JobKeeper payment, you do not pay superannuation on the $1,500 per fortnight. So that's no additional cost for you. remembering that the JobKeeper payment is a wages subsidy. It's not a subsidy for superannuation. So if you did bring someone back from stand down to perform work, then you'd be looking at paying superannuation. But if on stand down, they don't get it. If the employee earns $2,000 per fortnight and they're still earning that amount, then $1,500 for that fortnight will be a subsidy towards that $2,000 of wages. So that means you have to pay the extra $500 to make up the $2,000. Your contribution for superannuation will be based on the $2,000 because that's their wages. If an employee only earns $1,000 per fortnight, but because of the JobKeeper, you have to pass on to them the $1,500 subsidy, so they get an extra $500 for that fortnight. Your contribution is only based on the $1,000 because that's their wages that they earn for that period. The extra $500 that is paid in making it up to the full JobKeeper amount, you can pay superannuation on that $500 if you want to, but you don't have to. So there are 3 scenarios. On stand down, no super. They earn more than $1,500 per fortnight, you pay them the full amount, you pay superannuation on the full amount. If they earn less than $1,500 per fortnight, you only pay on the actual wages component, even though you're paying up to $1,500. Okay, regular and systematic. That's a question that's come up a few times when it comes to casuals being eligible. The Treasurer has indicated that the eligibility for a casual, which is 12 months regular and systematic work at the 1st of March, is based on what's in the Fair Work Act. So we do have a fair bit of case precedence about the concept of regular and systematic work. Generally speaking, based on the case law, if you've had someone who is regularly engaged to work, it doesn't have to be the same hours, the same days from week to week. It just means they're regularly called in to perform work. Then that's what we'd look at for being regular and systematic type work. Hi, Alex. So that's what you'd look at for the test of if they are regular and systematic. If you're not sure, have a look at their timesheets for the previous 12 months. And if you can say, yep, they've been here regularly over that period, so maybe every week they've worked a few hours, some weeks it might have been more or less, but they're regularly on the timesheets on our payroll, then that will probably cover it. But you can always contact us if you're not sure. Okay, for the stand down, template letter is the question. So you've got the stand down in place at the moment. If you want to utilise the variations that can come through from the Fair Work Act, which is the reduction in hours to match it up close to the 750, then this is a JobKeeper enabled stand down. So you will have to issue with your employees with a new stand down letter with those particular words as part of it to then enable you to utilise the new Fair Work Act provisions. We're developing a template, which is good news, which will be available for you all to utilise if you want to use the Fair Work Act. So as I mentioned, we had some Schedule L variations to the HIGA. That hasn't come through in the same form to the Registered and Licensed Clubs Award. The Restaurant Award is slightly different, but if you have an enterprise agreement, collective agreement in place at your workplace, you don't have the benefit of the award provisions. So this is where the variation to the Fair Work Act could be really useful for you to be able to reduce people's hours. And I've spoken to some members who At the moment, they have the majority of their employees on stand down. They've just got several who are working through JobKeeper. What they want to do is sort of have a rotation system where people can come in for a little bit at a time, not their full hours, but maybe for one shift per week, just to keep that connection in place. So the Fair Work Act amendments could be very useful for that use there. I think I've got through most. Okay, sole traders. Now I'm going to have to refer to something I've got in place for this. So sole traders will be eligible. So people who are self-employed will be eligible, provided that they meet certain criteria. So that is that there has to be a fall by 30% of their turnover. They had an ABN on or before the 12th of March this year, and there'll be some assessment out of income tax returns. They're not an employee of the employer. They're at least 16 years of age and an Australian citizen. So there are some ways in which sole traders can be eligible for the JobKeeper payment. One of the things that came through with the rules as well is that a representative of the business can also get the JobKeeper payment. So it's not just employees who get it. In some circumstances, there'll be a representative of the business who can also get the JobKeeper payment as well. It's not clear yet whether that has to be paid to that individual or whether it can go towards offsetting some of the additional costs of being a paymaster with the JobKeeper, but that's certainly something that's available. I'm still working through the rules, keeping an eye out on the ATO website and so forth. I'm also developing a Q&A information sheet that I hope to have finished sometime tomorrow morning. I will shoot that off to Sarah as soon as it's ready. That addresses a lot of these questions and probably some more for you. So if there are things that I haven't covered yet, stay tuned. There will be a more detailed information sheet available.
Joanna, we've just had a couple of paid parental leave questions come through the Q&A.
Yeah.
So if a staff member is currently on maternity leave or and they're due to return back to work, so the federal government paid parental leave has stopped, are they eligible for JobKeeper?
Yes, yes, they are, because they're not getting the government payment.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that would be a discussion to have with the employee to say, I just need some evidence that that payment period has finished.
Yeah.
And then you're essentially on unpaid parental leave. Yes.
Cool. And an apprentice still working, are they able to receive JobKeeper instead of the apprentice training allowance that's offered under the award?
Yes, because they can't get both. Now, let me find, I've got something here about that. Sorry, just bear with me. So, okay, so apprentices and trainees can get it so long as they're eligible. But if they are in receipt of the supporting apprentices and trainees wage subsidy, they can't get both. So, so what would happen is the JobKeeper payment, if the employer has been accepted as eligible and is seeking the JobKeeper payment, that would essentially overrule the other wages subsidy that's available for them. But that trainee or apprentice would need to then communicate that to the relevant authority so that they don't be seen to be double dipping. Oh, Okay, businesses that don't open until March 21, is there a possibility that it will be extended? I'm not sure what that. If the business was existing at the 1st of March, then it will be eligible. There are some circumstances where if there's been a transfer of business, it may be eligible as well. So where it's been sold and purchased by another party and employees have continued on with the new business. For a brand new business that is starting on
I think
after.
that's more, sorry, I think that's more, some businesses only open for the dry season.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay.
So they've shut down over the wet season and we're gearing up to start to open, and then the restrictions come in.
Okay. Well, that business is actually still operational, I guess, with you know, some of the reporting requirements, BAS and so forth still being part of it, even though there might not be any income. Then I think in that case that will probably, there won't be an issue there. Provided it meets all the other criteria. Yep. If the business has been trading for less than 12 months, then it's not necessarily going to be eligible for JobKeeper, but there is some discretion with how the assessment of the fall in trade for the 30% would apply. So that's where I'd probably go and see your financial advisor just to see how that will work for a period where the business has been closed for, I don't know, the last 4 months, or hasn't been open for the last 12. Okay. Okay, I think I might have covered most of the questions actually. I hope I have.
Do you want to just click on the Q&A icon on the bottom?
Yeah.
And so that's the questions that have come up.
Ah, great. Okay.
So there's a few more there.
Okay. Is there a maximum hours a person can work for another employer while being paid JobKeeper? The short answer is no. But if it's their second job, they can't be permanently employed by the other employer. So you would want to look at the form that the employee has to fill out about the JobKeeper, the form that the ATO hasn't yet released. There might be some more detail on that. I am told that it will be released hopefully in the next day or so. If an employee was employed in a full-time capacity as of the 1st of March and has since been made redundant and found other employment, and it's on a temporary basis. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, in terms of bringing them back onto your books, that's a decision that you will need to make and to discuss. And the one thing that I would probably want to be confident to have sorted is what happens to that redundancy and other payments that you made to them. Are they in a position to give it back to you in full, so that you can bring them back on? Just so it doesn't mean that you're having to pay, like there's money that you paid that in the end you didn't really need to pay. Yeah. Okay. We were in a partnership and applied and granted job seeker. Can we apply for JobKeeper? I'm not across what the partnership arrangements are, although from what I understand, only one person can be nominated to receive the JobKeeper allowance, so in the partnership. So it may be a case of weighing up the benefit of you both getting job seeker, where one person can only get JobKeeper, but I'm pretty sure for the other party you would be able to still retain your job seeker amount. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, as I said, one of you can be nominated to get JobKeeper. The other one would still retain the job seeker amount, but you can't both go for JobKeeper. How do we top up or pay in advance if we have 0 paying customers? Well, that's I guess one of the difficulties for JobKeeper and making a decision if you want to bring them back into the workplace, because it could be more beneficial for you if the employees stay on stand down and simply receive the payment. What happens if our employees are eligible but we can't pay them? This is another difficulty with the JobKeeper, is that it needs to be paid in advance. So for the previous fortnight, for this fortnight, an employer pays them, but they won't get the money back from the ATO. They won't get the value of the subsidy back until the first week of May. The Prime Minister has said you can take it to the bank and the banks will give you a bridging loan. That's, I guess, something that you could explore with your banks. I understand that there has been a lot of discussion with the Banking Association about it. So that could be useful to see how you might be able to do that. The other alternative is that you don't participate in the scheme. You don't have to if it's not affordable for you to do that. Are you obligated to keep the employee employed after receiving JobKeeper and your business has not sufficiently recovered? Okay, so in this situation, and this probably brings in another discussion point, you've probably been thinking ahead to how things are going to be when all of these restrictions are lifted. Certainly, I think for a lot of businesses, it's going to be, that first 2 weekends, people are going to be out and about, enjoying having breakfast out, having a few drinks, etc., etc. But I guess for you, because you know your businesses well and what it's been like in the past, and I guess in speculating, there may be a situation where you know that you're not going to need all of your employees. An example is I was talking to a member who has a large event space in Brisbane earlier, and they know that for an event, because it's about 300 people, so it's a big event space, they get bookings 6 to 12 months before an event. So they know that when the restrictions are lifted, it's only from that point forward that they'll start to get bookings for big events, and they're more likely to be 6 to 12 months later. So from an event staffing perspective, they know that they're not going to need all of those staff to be available at that time, or I guess until 6 months after all of this changes. From an employer's perspective, that's, I guess, a consideration that you need to look at, because while an employee is on a period of stand down, they are still accruing their leave entitlements. So if you've got someone on stand down for 6 months, they will have 6 months worth of annual leave and personal carers leave if a permanent employee. Might take them over a time frame period for a greater severance or notice payment if there's a redundancy to occur. So I can't tell you what to do if you know that you're not going to have the staff, or not going to need the staff in 3 months' time or 4 months' time, or however long we're in this situation for. But what I would say is, if you do decide that you're not going to need all of your staff, you're looking at the redundancy of their position, which means that that's a valid reason for the termination, and you'll have some obligations when it comes to redundancy. Because while the Fair Work Act has been amended for JobKeeper, and it's only in play until the 28th of September this year, and then the amendments are automatically rescinded, the provisions of the Fair Work Act that deals with a person being able to make an unfair dismissal claim, that's still applying as it is. So that hasn't changed. So you still need to be mindful of processes when it comes to reducing your staffing numbers because of the potential for an unfair dismissal claim. If you're going to wait until you see what happens, or then and your business doesn't recover quickly, you see that it's going to take a while, then again it comes to a redundancy of the situation. So with the redundancy, the employee is no longer employed, so they won't receive JobKeeper, but they can apply for JobSeeker, which is a little bit less, but there's still some support there available for them. What if we have a full-time staff that we don't require to work full-time hours? Okay, so as I mentioned before, you've got that ability to vary someone's hours of work under the Fair Work Act when they're on JobKeeper enabled stand down. So once the ATO has said that you're eligible as an employer and all those boxes are ticked, then that's where you can look at reducing their hours. And it would be on a temporary basis. If you don't want them to reduce their hours, but you'd rather them take some annual leave instead of working 5 days a week, you want them to work 3 and take 2 days of annual leave. Annual leave generally has to be agreed to between the parties. There is the ability in all of the awards, the HIGA, the RIA and the registered clubs, for people to take annual leave on half pay. So that could be an option. So they take 1 week of annual leave over 2 weeks and they get paid half pay for each week. That could be something you look at. Under the hospitality award, you can actually give someone direction with 24 hours notice to take annual leave, but that's only with the close down of the business. So if those situations don't apply, you've got to really agree with them to reduce to take the annual leave. But if you utilise what's in the Fair Work Act to reduce their hours, they might be quite open to making it up through taking annual leave and ask you for that.
Joanna, just on that, so if their employee agree, or if you reduce the employee's hours,
yep.
So you reduce a full-time employee's hours down.
Yes. Yep.
What entitlements would they be eligible for in terms of annual leave accrual and all that sort of stuff? Is it prorated or?
I understand that it will be as per normal, their substantive role. They'll still accrue as per normal, even though they're working less hours. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Can you clarify, I was advised that public holidays remain payable? Okay. This is an interesting one, and it's a good question to have raised. So the AHA's position has been that if you're on a period of stand down, you don't have ordinary hours of work. And for the benefit of public holidays in the Fair Work Act, an employee gets paid, or a permanent employee gets paid if they have, for a public holiday, for their ordinary hours of work on that public holiday. Our view is that when you're on stand down, you don't have ordinary hours, so you don't get paid. That position is one that we developed quite early on because there were other parties, including the Fair Work Ombudsman, who has said they should still get paid for it. We sought some fairly senior legal advice